How are we doing, everyone? This is Dr. B from Dr. B Teaches and the 7th Generation Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about what's taking place in Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand. Tens of thousands of people, the Māori, are rallying all over the country, protesting a bill that could potentially end the sovereignty of the Māori people. So I want to get into this and talk about how this isn't just about New Zealand. It's really a global struggle of Indigenous peoples, whether it's the Māori, Native Americans here in the United States, First Nations in Canada. It's about the ongoing fight to protect lands, cultures, and sovereignty in the face of these settler colonial systems. And of course, I want to talk about that beautiful display of resistance and defiance in Parliament with this young Māori woman who broke out and did the Haka. And that was one of the most incredible moments that I have ever seen. And I know so many people have been inspired by this. And so you have hundreds of thousands of people in New Zealand who are rallying together, opposing this bill that could effectively end the sovereignty of the Māori people. But the Haka has also inspired Indigenous people and allies all over the globe. And like I said, that was such an incredible and beautiful moment. And I know so many people have seen that Haka, and I think there's something about the Haka when it's done that resonates deeply with people who aren't even Māori. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that as well. Let's start with some history. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, is New Zealand's founding document. It established a framework for governance between the British Crown and the Indigenous Māori. Over 500 Māori chiefs signed the treaty, hoping it would provide mutual respect and shared authority. But as we have seen time and time again with settler colonialism, these promises simply were not kept. Land was confiscated, cultures were suppressed, and the Māori communities were left to struggle with systemic inequality and racism. Sound familiar? It's the same story of Indigenous peoples here in the United States, Canada, south of the border. It doesn't matter what settler colonial society we're talking about. The structure, the system of oppression is very similar. So settler colonialism operates on a very, very simple formula. You take the land and you erase the original people. This isn't just historical. It's an ongoing system of oppression, from pipelines cutting through sacred sites to legislation like we see right now that's being introduced in Parliament in New Zealand. The fight never ends, but neither does the resistance. It's really important to note that this treaty is the cornerstone of Māori efforts to reclaim their rights. And there has been a lot of progress in Aotearoa in reclaiming territories, protecting the culture, revitalizing the Māori language, which was on the verge of extinction. And so the Māori people have worked tirelessly resisting the structure of settler colonialism. And that's why this bill is so dangerous. It threatens to strip away those hard-fought victories. So what's the bill about exactly? The Treaty Principles Bill proposes to reinterpret key clauses of the treaty. Its supporters claim that it's about clarity, but Māori critics argue that it's an attempt to dilute Māori rights and roll back decades of progress. This isn't just a legal issue for the Māori, it's a deeply cultural one. The treaty is a living document that has helped guide New Zealand toward a greater, more equitable future for the Māori people. Changing how it's interpreted could undermine those efforts and set back race relations by decades. Here in the United States, we've seen similar attacks on Indigenous sovereignty. Think about the Dakota Access Pipeline or the countless broken treaties with Native nations. The story is always the same. In a settler colonial society, Indigenous lands and rights are treated as expendable. But here is the positive, is that we're seeing in New Zealand or Aotearoa, Indigenous peoples won't stand for this type of inequality. And you see this pushback now. People are not just interrogating the structure of settler colonialism and these oppressive systems, but they are actively working to dismantle them. And it's really, truly inspiring what we're seeing in New Zealand. And I feel as though this is going to empower people, not just in Aotearoa, but wherever Indigenous communities exist. And these marches and protests that we're seeing in New Zealand are extraordinary. We're talking about tens of thousands of people who are taking to the streets, who are demanding that the Maori people have their treaty rights protected. And the rally that you saw on Tuesday, the one to Parliament, was just amazing. Seeing the footage and seeing how many people were out there, it was one of the largest protests in the history of New Zealand. And you can tell that this is a cultural movement. You can see just how proud the Maori people are of their culture. And if you know their history, you know that they had to work really hard to keep their traditions alive, to keep their language alive. Not that long ago, the Maori language was in danger of going extinct. And the Maori people came together and created these incredible language revitalization programs. And today, you have Maori children and Maori people who speak their traditional language all over the country. So this is an incredible story, and it's so inspiring. I'm not Maori, but I can see so much of what's happening over in New Zealand on what's happening here in the United States and in Canada and basically all settler colonial societies. And just hearing the Maori people talk about their culture and their sovereignty, it's just really incredible. I want to talk a little bit more about the Haka. I've seen it performed several times, and it always gives me chills. When I saw this young Maori woman perform the Haka in defiance of this bill that threatens Maori sovereignty, it was really just an incredible moment. It made me very emotional, and I've talked to so many people who watched it and literally broke down in tears. And it's always kind of hit me like that. And I think there's a lot of people who don't really understand the Haka, but when it's being performed by the Maori, you can't help but feel its energy. And it is very deeply moving. And like I said, people who don't understand its meaning are often brought to tears and become emotional. And I think there's just something that's universal about the Haka and the way that it makes people feel, because we live in this world that often completely disconnects us from our traditional roots. And at the end of the day, we're all people of the earth. And all of our ancestors, it doesn't matter where you're from. If your ancestors are from Europe or from Africa, Asia, or the Americas, or the islands, our ancestors lived off the land, and we had our own ecosystems that we protected, that were sacred to us. Our culture, our identity, our spirituality was all embedded in the land. And of course, because of colonialism, because of these oppressive systems, that connection has often been broken for people. And I think one of the reasons why so many people are drawn to Indigenous cultures, because I think there is something that calls us back to that, at least for some people, certainly not everybody. And I think that's what the Haka does. It reminds us that we have a connection to the land, to the spirit, to each other. It's a call to remember who we are as human beings and what we should all be standing for, which is culture, community, and family. And the Haka is just so incredibly powerful. And when you see the Maori people performing it, man, it's just absolutely beautiful. The struggle for Maori rights in New Zealand is part of a larger story. Here in the United States, Native Americans are fighting to protect their lands from exploitation and desecration. In Canada, First Nation communities are demanding justice and recognition for the ongoing mistreatment of First Nation peoples there. And what ties these struggles together really is the system and the structure of settler colonialism. It's a system that's built on taking the land and erasing indigenous cultures. But what also ties them together is the resistance by indigenous peoples. And you could look at the Standing Rock protests as an example, the Maori who are protesting in Parliament. Indigenous people are rallying all over the globe in massive numbers to defend their water rights, their treaty rights, to defend the land. You have the Apache who are fighting these massive mining corporations like Resolution Copper in Arizona. These movements remind us that indigenous resistance is alive and strong. And so it's Native American Heritage Month. And of course, we want to celebrate the contributions and we want to celebrate all the amazing inventions that Native Americans created and the culture. But we should really focus a lot of our attention on the resistance and the dismantling of the system of control that we call settler colonialism. And I think that's something that we should all be very proud of, is that our ancestors have always fought for us to have a right to exist today. And every single indigenous person, doesn't matter if you're living here in Canada, Mexico, or the United States, or Aotearoa, you should be very proud of the fact that we are still here today, and we should celebrate that resistance, and we should continue this fight to completely dismantle these colonial systems. And without so many people out there, so many incredible leaders, the amazing people who are leading the resistance in Aotearoa and the people who have led these resistance struggles here in the U.S., indigenous communities wouldn't be around today. So what can we learn from all this? First, indigenous rights are a fight for human rights. When we protect the rights of indigenous peoples, we're protecting the integrity of our shared humanity. Secondly, these struggles are all interconnected. When the Maori fight for their treaty, when Native Americans resist pipelines, when First Nations demand justice, they're all a part of the same global movement against settler colonial oppression and violence. And finally, the Haka teaches us something really profound. It shows us the power of culture and connection and of standing together. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there's strength in unity and resilience in tradition. And as we navigate these really difficult times where there's just so much oppression and division, we can really take inspiration from the Maori and their allies. So let's honor their fight, and let's find ways to support indigenous movements, not just in Aotearoa, but worldwide. For me, watching this young lady protest so defiantly in Parliament was such an inspiration. Seeing these marches are just absolutely incredible. And they're a really important reminder, I think, to all of us about what's possible and also what's at stake as well. If we don't fight, we risk losing everything to these really harmful, capitalistic, colonial structures where culture doesn't matter. being somebody who is connected to the earth, connected to community, connected to family, that doesn't mean anything in a colonial society, one that's ruled by monopoly capitalism. The only thing that matters is money. And I think that watching and witnessing Indigenous people coming together and challenging that thought system, that really ugly value system, that's absolutely amazing. And so I think all of us need to maybe do some reflecting about this current world that we live in, and think about what our ancestors have done to get us here this far, and think about what are we going to do to make a better future, not just for ourselves, but also for the seventh generation coming. I want to thank everybody for listening to the 7th Generation Podcast and Dr. B Teaches. You can follow me on Instagram. My handle there is 7gen Podcast. I'm also on TikTok as well. My handle is Merciless Savages. And of course, I'm here on YouTube, Dr. B Teaches. The podcast streams on all major platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcast. Just type in 7th Generation Podcast and you'll find me. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram or on TikTok. And of course, thank you once again. I appreciate each and every one of you who spends the time to listen to my show, especially if you made it all the way to the very end. This is Dr. B. Till next time, don't forget, stay connected, stay informed, stay strong, and most of all, stay inspired.